Welcome back. In this series on building theoretical framework, we've learned what theory is, what it is not, and why theory matters. Today, we turn to an important question for any researcher. What is a theoretical contribution? In other words, how does your research add to theory, not just to practice or data? This topic is important because in academic research, theory is the currency we trade in. Every top-tier journal article in leadership research is expected to make a theoretical contribution. But many practitioner scholars may wonder, why bother with theory at all? Shouldn't I just solve real problems? In today's video, I'll demystify theoretical contributions, especially for those of you skeptical about theory's practical relevance. We'll see that contributing to a theory is about advancing our understanding in ways that ultimately improve your leadership practice. I'll break down 9 common ways researchers contribute to theory, from big, bold breakthroughs to subtle refinements. Let's start with some of the most dramatic, bold breakthroughs to contribute to theory, then working toward the more subtle theoretical refinements. First, challenging existing theory. One way to contribute theoretically is to challenge an existing theory, to call into question a theory that many in the field accept. This is the classic paradigm-busting move. Here, a researcher argues that the prevailing theory in the field is flawed, incomplete, or limited, and presents evidence or logic for a different view. Science does not progress linearly, but sometimes undergo revolutions when an existing paradigm fails and new paradigm replaces it. Challenging a dominant theory is similar to initiating this mini revolution in your field. You identify anomalies, which are the findings the old theory cannot explain or expose contradictions. Then you force the field to reconsider its core ideas. When enough anomalies accumulate, researchers begin to lose faith in the dominant theory and explore alternatives, which leads to a paradigm shift. A scholar who challenges a popular theory is in essence acting as an agent of a possible paradigm shift. In leadership research, early great man trait theories assume that certain stable traits, such as intelligence and confidence, guaranteed leadership success. But in the 1960s, researchers like Fred Fiedler began challenging this theory. He showed that leadership effectiveness also depended on context, which was an idea captured in the contingency models. For example, contingency theory demonstrated that a strict trait approach failed in some situations. A highly task-oriented leader could succeed or fail depending on situational favorability. This challenge to the trait theory fundamentally shifted the field toward situational and relational theories. Similarly, agency theory long dominated assumptions about managers being self-interested. Stewardship theory, however, challenged this view by proposing that managers can behave as trustworthy stewards under the right condition, a direct contradiction of the agency theory's core premise. Those works provided theoretical arguments and evidence that did not fit the old theory and forced scholars to refine and even abandon the prevailing theories. Challenging existing theory is high risk, high reward. If you are correct, you can substantially shift scholarly discourse. But established theories often had loyal adherents and piles of supporting evidence. Overturning established theories requires strong rationale and compelling evidence. Challenging the hardcore assumptions of a theory, say questioning the assumption of rational self-interest in economic models, effectively launches a new paradigm. In practice, scholars should engage in problematization, which means systematically questioning the assumptions others take for granted. If you want to learn more about problematization, check out my previous video on Sin of Leadership Research. So here is a question to you. Think of a theory in your field that you feel does not align with reality. What assumptions of that theory could be challenged, and what evidence may support an alternative view? Number 2. Develop a new theory. Perhaps the most obvious way to contribute to theory is to develop a new theory from scratch. This means offering an original theory that did not previously exist. Challenging an existing theory operates in relation to an old paradigm, but creating a new theory may start more or less fresh. You address a phenomenon that has not been theoretically explained, or offer a wholly new explanation that departs from existing theories. This path requires a great deal of creativity and insight. Scientists progress by proposing creative hypotheses and then testing them. When you develop a new theory, you are launching one of those bold conjectures, a creative leap beyond known theories. Of course, your theory must be testable, which is falsifiable to be scientific. Transformational leadership theory was a new theory developed in the 1970s and 80s that reshaped how we think about effective leadership. James Burns introduced the concept of transformational versus transactional leadership, and Bernard Bass built a full theory around it. Prior to this, leadership research had different threats, traits, behaviors, and contingencies. But Bass' theory of transformational leadership was a new theoretical contribution. What's a novel theoretical contribution? It argues that leaders inspire and intellectually stimulate followers to achieve higher levels of performance and morality. It did not just tweak an existing idea. Instead, it proposed new constructs, for example, idealized influence and inspirational motivation, and also propose new relationships, for example, the idea that inspiring vision can fundamentally transform an organization's culture. Similarly, in psychology, the introduction of emotional intelligence created an entirely new theoretical construct of EQ, a form of intelligence about recognizing and managing emotions. This new theory addressed the phenomena, which is why some smart individuals fail in social or leadership roles. And those phenomena were not well explained by existing IQ or personality theories. It catalyzed a wave of research and practical applications, from leadership training to hiring evaluations. To develop a new theory, researchers often draw on creative analogies, in-depth qualitative observations, or synthesis of prior findings. Carl Weick famously described theory building as disciplined imagination. This theory building process needs a blend of creativity and rigorous thinking. New theory does not always mean completely unrelated to prior work. Often it builds on gaps or unconnected pieces of existing knowledge. In fact, the genesis of many new theory is found in anomalies or unsolved problems that existing theories leave open. For example, if current motivation theories cannot explain why volunteers who are not paid are highly motivated, you may develop a new theory of altruistic motivation. I need to point out that new theories are held to high standards because they don't have history. If you propose new theories, you must clearly articulate the theory's constructs, the what, the relationships, which is the how, and the underlying logic, which is the why, and convince others that this theory is plausible and valuable. A theoretical contribution must specify what is new about what you are explaining and why it matters. New theories that are too abstract or unsupported may be dismissed as mere speculation. But when done well, proposing a new theory can be a landmark contribution, which opens up entire new lines of research. Third, another important way to contribute is by synthesizing divergent literature. In essence, you bring together ideas from different fields or research streams to create novel theoretical insights. Many influential theories emerge by integrating constructs that were previously isolated. The synthesis can produce fresh perspectives that neither literature can achieve alone. It's like being a matchmaker for theories. You take theory A from one domain and theory B from another and combine them and develop theory C, which addresses a complex problem more holistically. This approach is often very useful in interdisciplinary fields like leadership and organizational studies, where relevant knowledge may be scattered across psychology, sociology, economics, politics, and education, and someone needs to connect those dots. For example, emotional labor. Synthesize sociology of emotions with economic and job theories. It combined insights about how people manage feelings with the context of service work in organizations, which results in a new construct that certain jobs require workers to manage their emotions as part of the role. For example, flight attendants must smile and be friendly. This theoretical construct emerged from connecting two domains, emotion regulation and labor. Synthesizing literature often means you conduct integrative reviews. It requires breadth of knowledge and the ability to see analogies across fields. You need to synthesize literature that can be seen as building bridging theories that expands levels and fields. It's highly creative because you are essentially forging connections where none existed clearly before. Here is a key point. Synthesis it's not just summary. A literature review that simply summarizes two fields side by side is not yet a theoretical contribution. The contribution comes when you integrate them to generate new propositions, new theoretical framework, or new theoretical models. If you synthesize literature on leadership with research on mindfulness, you may propose a new theoretical theory of mindful leadership that yields novel hypotheses. For example, the school principles mindfulness practice improve organizational climate via better emotion regulation. The test of a good synthesis is whether it yields insights that were not obvious when each literature was considered alone. Fourth, clarifying and redefining constructs. Moving now to more fine-grained contributions, clarifying and redefining key constructs is a foundational way to contribute to theory. Every theory uses constructs or concepts. Think of terms like leadership motivation, accountability, community engagement, etc., etc. And very often, those constructs become murky or stretch in meaning over time. I've discussed in my previous video on ambiguous constructs. A theoretical contribution can be made by improving the precision and the clarity of a construct, or even redefining it in a way that resolves inconsistencies in how it's being used. Construct clarity lies at the heart of theory building. Clearly defined constructs encourage researchers to generate more effective research questions and build cumulative knowledge. When we clarify what exactly a construct means and does not mean, we strengthen the whole theoretical framework built around it. The construct of leadership itself has undergone clarification and redefinition over decades. Early on, leadership was often implicitly equated with formal authority or personal traits. In recent years, scholars have redefined leadership to include shared and process-oriented perspectives. For example, shared leadership reconceptualize leadership not as a single individual's influence, but as a network of influence processes situated in the team. This theoretical refinement effectively expanded the construct of leadership beyond the heroic leadership model. Similarly, the construct of organizational culture was nebulous until Edgar Schein provided a clearer definition by identifying its layers, artifacts, espoused values, basic assumptions. Schein's clarification helped distinguish culture from related constructs like climate or strategy. Clarifying constructs means you will need to resolve semantic confusion. You point out that two terms are being used interchangeably but actually mean different things, which is the classic jingle-jangle fallacy where different names for the same construct or same name for a different construct can cause confusion. Clarifying those constructs also means narrowing or broadening a definition. Sometimes the constructs are defined so narrowly they miss important aspects. Other times they are defined so broadly they lose meaning. Your job is to find that right balance and boundary specification. If a theory is a language, then our constructs are the vocabulary. A construct should have a clear definition, scope conditions, who and what it applies, and differentiation from neighboring or sibling constructs. In fact, improving construct clarity can even bridge the academic practitioner gap. A well-defined construct is easier for practitioners to grasp and measure in their context. Let's say you notice that researchers use the term community engagement in very different ways. Some researchers mean parental involvement, others include student voice, others refer to business partnership. If you carefully analyze the literature and propose a refined definition and typology of community engagement with subdimensions, criteria for inclusion and exclusion, you are making a theoretical contribution by helping everyone think more clearly about this construct of community engagement. The next type of contribution is specifying boundary conditions of a theory. Every theory has some limits, context, or conditions under which it holds true and beyond which it may not. When you specify a boundary condition, you're essentially answering the when, where, and for whom questions of a theory. This strengthens theory by describing its scope. Many theories are initially proposed in broad strokes, sometimes implicitly assumed to be universal, but later work shows they actually apply only under certain circumstances. Identifying those circumstances is a valuable theoretical contribution because it adds precision to the theory. Newton's laws work well for everyday physics, but break down at quantum scales. Those conditions are boundaries where new theories such as Einstein's relativity theory and quantum mechanics take over. Similarly, social science theories rarely apply universally. Context, which means time, place, and population, matters. Specifying boundaries is like drawing a map. Inside this region, our theory's prediction holds. Outside the region, beware and use a different theory. Boundary conditions describe the who, where, and when of a theory. For example, does this leadership theory apply to who? For example, school principals or corporate manager, and where? In what culture or industries? And when? In stable periods or crisis? For example, goal-setting theory posits that specific challenging goals lead to higher performance. Initially, this theory was presented as a general principle of motivation, but subsequent research found important boundary specifications. If a task is extremely complex and novel, setting very specific goals can actually hurt learning and creativity because it narrows the focus too much. Similarly, Goal setting may work differently across cultures. For example, individualistic culture versus collective culture, which is a boundary condition related to the cultural context. Systematically studying those boundaries, you can specify boundary conditions of goal setting theory. For example, goal setting improves performance except when the task requires creative exploration, in which case two specific goals may impede performance. Identifying that condition is a theoretical contribution. It tells us where the theory stops working. Another example is a transformational theory, which I've already mentioned earlier. Transformational leadership was later found to have boundary conditions. It tends to be more effective in times of change or crisis than in very stable, routine environments. If a researcher provides evidence that transformational leadership is less effective or even counterproductive in highly bureaucratic, stable organizations, that finding draws a boundary around the theory's applicability. In specifying boundary conditions, you may also discover moderators, which are factors that modify the relationship predicted by theory. For example, a theory may predict X causes Y, but you find it's only true when Z is high and not true when Z is low. That effectively says Z is a boundary condition for the XY relationship. Self-determination theory argues that giving people autonomy improves their motivation and performance. A boundary condition may be the readiness or skill level of the individuals. Perhaps autonomy helps highly skilled employees, but confuses novices who actually need more guidance. Specifying that boundary makes the theory more precise and useful. Specifying boundary conditions often comes from cumulative empirical findings, the patterns where a theory fails in certain cases, or from logical analysis of assumptions. For example, a theory that assumes rational actors has a boundary condition. It won't apply when actors don't have information or ability to be rational. Specifying boundary conditions is like quality control for theories. You are testing their edges. Importantly, doing this improves practical relevance too. Practitioners want to know, will this theory work in my situation? When we state boundary conditions, we give a more honest and detailed answer. We move beyond the generic one-size-fits-all claims. Another common theoretical contribution is extending an existing theory to a new context. This means taking a theory that was developed in one setting, let's say business organization in the West, and applying it in a different context, let's say nonprofit organizations or a different culture or a different level of analysis, like individual versus team. You test the theory's robustness and you often have to adapt or refine it to fit the new context, thereby enriching the theory. If the theory holds in the new context, you've shown its applicability. If it doesn't fully hold, you identify what it needs to be modified. Both outcomes add to our understanding of a phenomenon. Here is an example. Social identity theory in social psychology explains individual group behavior and prejudice. Researchers then extended this theory to organizations by showing that employees identify with their organization similar to how people identify with social groups. This application to a new context, which is workplace settings, opened up a whole area of research on organizational identification. The theory had to be elaborated. For example, what organizational factors shape identification and what outcomes are we talking about? For example, job satisfaction and organizational commitment. Extending a theory from psychology into leadership demonstrates the theory's power in the new domain and often refines the theory to be more context-specific. Here is another example. self-determination theory, which posits basic human psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness, was initially formulated in general psychology and education. Researchers later extended self-determination theory to the workplace context by theorizing how workplace policies like giving employees more autonomy or feedback for competence influence motivation and performance. With that extension, we now must consider contextual factors like organizational structure or job design, which makes the self-determination theory more applicable to leadership research. Extending theory to new contexts contributes by testing the theory's boundaries related to specifying boundary conditions, as we've discussed, and it often uncovers hidden assumptions. Sometimes when you take a theory to a new context, you discover it implicitly assumed something about the original context. For example, a leadership theory developed in an individualistic culture may assume people value personal achievement. But when applied to a collectivist culture, the prediction may change, which indicates the theory needs cultural calibration. The result could be a more culturally inclusive theoretical framework. One thing to ensure when extending to a new context is that you account for contextual differences very thoughtfully. The goal is not to force fit a theory to every situation, but to see what travels and what needs modification. For example, if you apply a school leadership theory from the US to schools in a developing country, you may extend the theory by adding considerations of resource scarcity or different community roles. That addition is the theoretical contribution itself. It adapts the theory for a broader use. For practitioners, this contribution is directly meaningful because it helps translate theories across different settings. A school principal hearing about a business management theory may ask, but will that work in my school? A researcher who has extended that theory to educational context can answer with more confidence. Number 7, revising or challenging assumptions. Every theory is built on assumptions, often implicit beliefs about how the world works. For example, humans are rational actors or organizations seek to maximize efficiency. Another theoretical contribution is to revise a theory's assumptions. This overlaps somewhat with challenging existing theory, but the emphasis here is on the assumptive foundation. You may accept much of the theory's structure, but change what it assumes at its base. Challenging assumptions often goes hand in hand with critical thinking and creative thinking. It asks us, what is the theory taking for granted? And what if that's not true or not always true? I touched on agency theory versus stewardship theory earlier. Agency theory in economics and management assumes agents, who are managers, are self-interested and prone to shirking, thus need monitoring and incentives. Stewardship theory challenges that very assumption. It argues that under some conditions, for example, when managers identify with the organization or have intrinsic motivation aligned with organizational success, managers will act as responsible stewards, not opportunistic agents. Both theories are trying to explain how managers behave, but they diverge in the core assumption about human nature. Here, we explicitly revise the assumption from people are self-serving to people can be collectivist and trustworthy. This opens us a new way of understanding organizational governance and leadership. The researchers didn't throw out everything from agency theory, the general problem of aligning managers and owners, but they provided a fundamentally different lens on it. Another example comes from psychology. Rational choice theories long assumed decision makers have stable preferences and full complete information. But behavioral economists challenged those assumptions and introduced boundary rationality and cognitive biases. Prospect theory didn't discard the idea that people evaluate gains and losses. It revised assumptions about consistency and risk perception, for example, assuming loss aversion. This dramatically improved the explanatory power for decision-making under uncertainty. In practical terms, how do you contribute by challenging assumptions? One approach is through problematization, systematically identifying and questioning assumptions in existing literature to generate new research questions. If all mainstream leadership theories assume a leader is a formally appointed individual, you may problematize that and ask, what if leadership can emerge from any member of the group, which leads to the theories of distributed leadership and shared leadership. Revising assumptions can be very sensitive. You are effectively saying, our field has been assuming X, but what if X is wrong or only sometimes true? Perhaps to prepare to justify why a new assumption may actually explain things better. You can assume that people are irrational or employees seek meaning, not just money, but you must use the existing literature to justify your assumptions. Empirical evidence in the existing literature often helps because it may show many instances where the old assumptions fail. Over time, if your revised assumptions gains acceptance, the textbook will change once a radical assumption becomes the new normal. So my question for you is to identify an implicit assumption in a theory you know very well. How may changing that assumption change the theory or its predictions? Number 8, developing mid-range theory. Not all theoretical contributions require grand, sweeping change. Some of the most valuable contributions are the development of mid-range theories. The term theories of the middle range comes from sociologist Robert Merton, who argued that instead of striving for one big unified theory of everything, which can become too abstract, social science should focus on theories that are in the middle, more generalized than mere empirical description, but more concrete and testable than all-encompassing theoretical frameworks. Developing mid-range theory means formulating a theory that addresses a specific phenomenon or context in depth, which can then be tested and refined, and perhaps later connected with other mid-range theories. The garbage can model of organizational decision-making is a mid-range theory. It does not attempt to explain all decision-making everywhere, as a grand rational choice theory might. Instead, the garbage can model of organizational decision-making specifically explains decision processes in organizations characterized by ambiguity and fluid participation. It proposes a set of constructs, for example, choices, solutions, participants, and problems that float around and sometimes coincide by chance. This theory explains a specific class of chaotic decisions. This mid-range theory was a big contribution for the niche of decisions under ambiguity. Another example is leader-member exchange theory. It's also a mid-range theory. It focuses narrowly on the relationship quality between a leader and each follower. It does not try to be a full theory of leadership effectiveness. Instead, it investigates one aspect, the dyadic exchange, and identifies how high-quality versus low-quality exchanges develop and what outcomes they have. Leader-member exchange theory is now influential in leadership research. It provides insight that leaders do not have a uniform style with everyone. They form different relationships with different followers, and that variance matters. Developing a mid-range theory means you identify a gap where existing broader theories are not very explanatory. It's somewhat the opposite of synthesizing divergent literature. Here, you may zoom in on a particular mechanism or context that has not been theorized adequately. Mid-range theories can also serve as bridges between micro-level theories and macro-level theories. They may connect individual behavior to organizational outcomes in a constrained way. For new researchers, developing a mid-range theory can be a very practical route. Instead of trying to revolutionize an entire field, you may develop a theory about a specific phenomenon you've observed in your research. For example, you may develop a mid-range theory of principal succession in rural schools, a theory that explains how incoming principals gain community trust or fail to in that particular context. You identify key constructs like community legacy, outsider status, and entry strategy. You show how different constructs relate to school outcomes. This would be more than just a case narrative, since you'd abstract it into a theoretical model, but less than a universal leadership theory because it's specific to rural school succession. It's a valid and useful contribution that other researchers can test it in similar contexts or compare it to urban or suburban settings. Mid-range theories are also valuable for bridging theory and practice because they often deal with concrete, contextualized problems. They are easier to explain to practitioners in that context. It resonates because the theory is about their world. Over time, multiple mid-range theories may be integrated or at least create a toolbox of theories that practitioners and researchers draw on as appropriate. Our final category is a more reflective type of contribution, theorizing absence, silence, or ignorance. This means deliberately turning attention to what is not being said, the gaps, the omissions, and unknowns, and making those into an object of theorizing. It's an approach often seen in emerging areas of research. The basic idea is that sometimes what a theory leaves out is as important as what it contains. Focusing on those absences can help us develop new theoretical insights. It means you explore areas of ignorance, questions what we don't even know we don't know. An example of this category of theoretical contribution is organizational silence. Many organizations have a climate where employees withhold input or concerns, which is an absence of a voice. Prior organizational theories had focused on active resistance or support, but the silence, employee says nothing, was relatively untheorized. Researchers then explicitly theorized silence as a collective phenomenon with causes like fear of retaliation and effects like stagnation. The researchers took a non-event, not speaking up, and made it a phenomenon to explain. Taking this route has a critical and even disruptive quality. It may question why the field has not addressed something, perhaps due to convenience or because it did not fit dominant paradigms. For example, organizational research for decades focused on managers and paid scant attention to janitors or secretaries, an absence of the voice from below. Theoretical contributions in labor and inclusion studies have since given voice to those lower power roles and changed how we understand organizational dynamics. For example, the construct of emotional labor gave voice to service workers' experience. Similarly, dark side theories like theories of organizational corruption and workplace incivility arose by noticing that positive organizational behavioral literature was silent about negative or toxic behaviors, except as anomalies. So scholars started explaining, theorizing the dark side as a phenomenon in their own right. In fact, I just published a book chapter, Neuroscience of Leaders' Incivility, in the book titled Incivility and Workplace Toxicity in P-12 Schools, which examines exactly the dark side of leadership. As a new researcher, you can ask, what is my field not talking about? What important variables or groups or outcomes are being overlooked? If you spot a silence, say, all leadership assumes a hierarchy and ignores self-managing teams, you could contribute by building theory around that neglected scenario, the dynamics of teams without leaders. On this topic, check out my previous video on zombie idea number 3, a team must have a leader. Theorizing absence, silence, and ignorance requires a little bit of boldness to say, we've been ignoring this. But when you back it up with evidence that this absence matters, it can be very compelling. I've covered 9 types of theoretical contributions. It's important to remember that theoretical contribution is not measured by how famous the theory becomes, but by how much it advances our understanding. A small but insightful contribution that helps many researchers make better sense of data, like a clarified construct or a newly identified boundary conditions, is tremendously valuable. But a grand theory that is elegant but does not fit reality very well may have little lasting impact. The best theoretical contributions tend to be those that other scholars find helpful for thinking and designing research.